Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining and welcome to the day 9 of the bootcamp. And today we have Vlad with us, along with Gilda and Gina. And today's topic is going to be about the digital marketing proficiency, the best practices and the compliances. And in one of the previous sessions, Chris has covered about the marketing cloud product inventory, the other studios and builders that are available for the marketing cloud. And in today's session, Vlad is going to cover about the governance and compliances in the marketing cloud and the best practices that we should follow. Before we get started, this session is being recorded and we are going to upload them, and we'll share the links with whoever needs it before November 18th, and they will be made public after November 18th. And please post your questions in the chat window and we will answer the questions at the end of the session. And if there are any unanswered questions, we have Ask Me Anything panel coming up, that is on 18th of November. The timing will be 3 p.m. And in that session, you will have an opportunity to have your questions answered from the experts. The questions can be anything related to the marketing cloud administrator certification, and it could be related to any of the topics that we have discussed during these bootcamp sessions. And you will find all the homework and other resources shared on the Slack channel. And if you have any comments or feedback, or you want any other topics to be covered or anything that you want to add, please share them on the Slack channel or on Twitter by using these hashtags. And today's session, it's all Vlad's, and I want to give a special shout out to Vlad. Vlad has been a very great supporter of all the bootcamps. So right from the first bootcamp that we have conducted last year, the Marketing Cloud Administrator Certification Bootcamp, and from then on, the Developer Bootcamp, the Consultant Bootcamp, and now the Administrator Bootcamp again. He has been an active speaker and not just presenting the session, he has been involved behind the scenes, planning for the sessions and providing suggestions and providing his expert knowledge. I really can't thank him enough for all the support that he has been providing. And Vlad, I take this opportunity to thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jyothna. I think it's been great opportunity for me to share, I guess, some of the tidbits. So yeah, it's good to be helpful here.
We'll be glad for that, Vlad. And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Vlad. I'm going to stop my screen share. You take it over.
Let me do that. So let's see. Okay. Well, let's see. So yes, welcome everyone. I assume it's a bit of an afternoon time for most of you if you're coming up from the US. So I appreciate the a bit of a change in time. I guess our morning in Australia and with the daylight saving, it's a bit of a change in overall plan for how things are running. So my name is Vladimir Silek. I will be presenting today the digital marketing proficiency second part of the topic, focusing around compliance and best practices. A little bit about myself, and I'll probably need to just turn on the camera just to see if people can actually see me. So I've been with Salesforce for a bit over than 80 years. And first part of my journey, I spent with professional services of Marketing Cloud. I was a solution architect working with a good number of customers, small and big, within our ANZ and a bit more broadly ASEAN ecosystem. And then second part of my journey, I changed my role a little bit and really focused on sharing the knowledge, experience, and building up new learning content and experiences for our consulting partners and implementing partners. And that's where I am today. I look after marketing products within our sort of Salesforce platform. So Marketing Cloud MJ itself, or messaging and journey as we refer to, as well as things like CDP and Interaction Studio, and really anything that sort of sits under the umbrella of marketing, along with a few other colleagues, amazing colleagues. I wanted to say thank you before I start, I guess, for an opportunity to be here and for your time, because I know it's a big investment from your side to invest into certification, and we certainly see within Salesforce, and I guess outside of Salesforce, it's a big need these days. I'm sure most of you heard about the skills shortage, and it's becoming a global problem. So everyone who is interested to get a bit more knowledgeable, a bit more experience in the platform is always welcome. For me personally, I find that curiosity of people and investment in their own learning and development is significant. That's why I was always a big supporter of these different programs. Because I do believe that people who are genuinely curious and want to become better and become more skilled, professionally better, that is, then they deserve the right to get a chance. And, the people who have the knowledge and experience should be able to share it up. So thank you for that opportunity to share with you some of my points of view. As I said, today, topic for us is compliance and governance, and somewhat deliverability of the emails, and sort of exploring how these different options are coming up within the Marketing Cloud platform when it comes down to data security and so forth. I think Chris did an amazing job in the earlier session, discovering all the different studios and builders that comprise our Marketing Cloud platform. And I hope that you now feel very comfortable, at least understanding what sort of comes up into what we refer to as a Marketing Cloud, because it's not a single product. As a reminder, you can expect approximately 8 questions on that topic. And what I found personally, because when I was taking the exam, it was interesting. I found that there is a bit more sort of overlapping knowledge areas. So while it's roughly 8 questions across all of these 3 different lines, essentially some of the questions I found personally in my exam take were sort of taking it to somewhat like 13 or 14 questions around some of the concepts that I'm going to talk to you today. I will try to draw some practical implications around the features and functionalities to make sure that we not just looking at the certification journey, but really upskilling you and making you ready to be administrators of Marketing Cloud when the time comes in. And beginning of all of that is compliance and governance. So when we talk about that, it's always in reference to digital marketing. So don't think it's an overall compliance. And the very first question I usually ask is, why does it even matter? Why do we need to be concerned about that? And from the early beginning of ExactTarget and continuation of the Marketing Cloud and so forth, one big thing to be aware of is that we are permission-based platform. So we want to make sure that our customers can communicate and engage with their customers without any challenges. And when it comes down to digital marketing specifically, main focus seems to be around deliverability, making sure that we can deliver all of these digital communications to the end destination, whether it's an email inbox, avoiding all the different subfolders, as well as making sure that messages are coming to mobile devices and whatever else that might be. More recently, you've probably seen some of the websites. So the website messaging capabilities, like all of these, really rely back onto some of the legal justification to actually communicate with them. So our customers should not be communicating with their audiences and subscribers if the permission was not acquired. There's a really good write-up, and the link is in the deck. I would encourage you to have a read through that. So whether you're on consulting side of the story, whether you're a customer yourself, we always encourage end users of the platform to be aware that we are, in fact, permission system, and therefore any communications should be based off the permission from the end subscriber to send the messages to them. Besides the actual sort of legal implication, I guess it is important to think that from marketing standpoint of view, it makes perfect sense because you want to talk to people who are interested to hear from you. And you want to make sure that your communications are relevant, they're not sort of out of interest, and they are providing use for whether it's education, whether it's experience sort of augmentation, and adding more and more value to the end subscriber who receives this communication at the end of the day. So when we talk compliance in the sense of sending these communications, the one big thing that sort of comes into play and really is embedded into our at least email platform capabilities is reliance and adherence to the canned spam compliance requests. So what that sort of comes up with is the need for a company who sends the communication is accurately identify themselves. So when you think about yourself, your personal experience, if you think about your inbox when you receive communications from different brands, most likely some of them are the same as I do. And a lot of them, surprisingly or not surprisingly, would be our customers. You will see that the whole concept of from name, from email address, along with a few other details, the subject line, like all of these details, many little pieces of information, they all reflect and represent company who sends that communication. That's something that we encourage. It is required by the legal side of things, but it is important to establish that communication good practice with the end subscriber to ensure they recognize you from varieties of other messages. I was kind of recently thinking about that, if you think about your inbox, how many communications you receive in any given day, and whether it's a professional communication or not, you do want to ensure that the message stands out so that you as an end user versus you as a sender can really focus on your conversation and come through all the rest of the noise and competitors and other competing priorities. Besides subject line and from or sender details, we require that the email information includes physical mailing address for the company that sends that communication. And that is required, I guess it's just more legislative thing, but we embed it into the platform ability to incorporate the details of the physical address right within the business unit configuration. So when you are configuring business unit, you would normally see details to fill up for the physical address. And that is the information that can then later down the track be included into the message payload. So we've got personalization attributes that can be replaced, and platform will automatically do that for you. In addition to that, sort of informing and subscriber about who you are, where you're from, the second part of that is to provide the ability for them to unsubscribe from receiving these communications. And one of the things I do have a highlight here is remembering that considering regional differences, because it's the whole requirement of how do you need to provide that unsubscribe experience altogether. So initially it was the message, as you can see here, we should not require a person to log into more than a single experience or go through more a single page in order to change their subscription preferences or overall just unsubscribe. Although in different countries, as I said, that requirement varies slightly. So from practical experience point of view, it's a great experience. And again, put yourself in the shoes of end receiver. If you receive communication and you think it's not appropriate to you anymore, you might want to change what other communications you receive from the brand. Or you might actually say, look, I'm not interested, let's say time to move on, time to part. And if the experience that is giving you to unsubscribe is easy to follow, it's very intuitive, it's not hidden somewhere in the message body, then it leaves you a very good emotional footprint, even when you depart and part, I guess, your ways with a brand. So it's good marketing tactic to ensure that this is out there. It's sort of, I guess, part of the trust build and transparency to provide all the needs and controls into the hands of the unsubscriber. And then when you receive this communication or sort of preferences changes on subscribe request, we do in fact remind you that it is important to honor these opt-outs quite promptly. Again, depending on the country where you are, the legislative process might be implying different timings. So how quickly do you need to do? We might say it's 10 business days, but it could actually be 5 business days in certain places on Earth. So therefore, always check your local geographical sort of appearance in terms of what makes sense and what you should be legally respecting in terms of doing that. But practically, I mean, if the person giving you an indication that they don't want to receive your messages anymore, I would feel that it is important to act on that as soon as possible. So leaving it for the next day is not necessarily the best way to handle that. The other thing is to remember that within the message itself, that link that provides the ability to unsubscribe has to be valid for at least 30 days after you send that communication. So these are like sort of on the first glance simple requirements, but they are important to keep in mind. And some of the questions that you might face on the exam around this is just sort of putting them into the context of what type of information needs to be included in the email message when it comes down to the compliance. Where does the configuration sort of come from? And when you go into the platform, you will start seeing that I believe we've got that sort of covered in the previous session. I think Natasha was covering up the email studio and talking about configuration of the sender profiles, where you use from information and so forth, and validating the domains. But when you do go into that send classification, that's where that can spam classification is sort of embedded into the platform. And you have two options to choose from. One of them is transactional and the other one is commercial. There's a sort of the subtle differences between them. I mean, if you think about that, transactional messaging has to be a bit less restrictive, and in fact it is. It does not necessarily require you to include unsubscribe mechanisms when you send this communication, but it sort of gets down to, and the reason I mention that it's practical side of that is to ensure that you understand what is the message content and intent is. So if there is any solicitation about transacting beyond what was already happened, so when you send an email or when you send a message, it usually is in response to something, or it might be an outbound activity where you initiate the message. So if you're initiating communication and conversation, then transactional is most likely not the case, because there is no event that stipulates that message. So it becomes a commercial communication most of the time. Then transactional is more, think about that password reset or order confirmation message. Even though it might include details of your purchase, it doesn't solicit you to do business anymore. And then the sort of the not so clear line becomes if you do want to include things like predictive recommendations and say maybe along the side of the product that you just purchased, you would like to also consider a couple of other things. And that's where that transactional all of a sudden becomes commercial. So practically, always ensure that you think twice about the classification. And then when it comes down to commercial selection, that flag will sort of validate and enforce some of the inclusions. So things like unsubscribe link, the preference center link, the physical email address into the email, and the system will validate that these have been included, versus when you go into transactional, as I said, we are less restrictive here when it comes down to send. Next step sort of to think about is the sender reputation. Again, it kind of comes down from we start sort of, we configure the platform, and this is kind of shifting the task not necessarily into administrative line of activities and jobs, but more operational and marketing in the full stream. The idea is to understand that every account when we start in Marketing Cloud sort of starts from zero. So we all provided with a new IP address. We have our potentially new domain configured or subdomain, combine them together, and we now start communicating with subscribers. And from the internet service providers, they sort of look, or email service providers, they look at the inbound flow of all of these different communications, and they sort of assess you and categorize what's in the message. Is it useful, wanted, or not wanted? Does it have sort of a spam sort of footprint and feel to that, and so forth. So essentially, there's varieties of different metrics and reasons that sort of included and combine all together to understand whether it's a wanted or unwanted communication and what happens with it. So as you can see, the aim and objective of all the sort of setup and configurations and some of the strategies and tactics is to ensure that we deliver 100% to all the people in the audience list. And again, it's desire, not always works to the 100%, but that's the intent. What contributes to these factors? As I said, there's varieties of these things. So if you think that could be user-driven, or they could be in control of the platform and the brands who initiate that conversation. So if you think about the customers providing things like invalid email address, whether it's a typo or intentional, they might be leaving the email addresses that have not been used for a long period of time, or they are designed to capture all the spam communications, and these are referred to as a spam trap. Looking into communications that are not being opened or clicked through. Again, that's another factor that does contribute to the sort of the the healthy rating of the email from the provider standpoint of view. And then whether or not there are any complaints coming from the customer. So you send communication, they assumably people opted in to receive them, and all of a sudden they opting out, right? So as long as there are no complaints, there's maybe an unsubscribe workflow rather than complain and flagging the message that's a spam in the inbox. These are more user sort of driven behaviors. Then you look into the into what is in the control of Marketing Cloud, I would put it this way, but essentially the brands, right? So that's normally comes down to authentication of the domain, and send reputation sort of flows from there. So you got things like DKIM, SPF, sender ID. So essentially adding an additional verification to configuration of the domain, to the IP address, to some of the headers within the message when they send out, and combining all of these different details together, that sort of stipulates whether or not the account is authenticated and supposed to be trusted, because it does come up with additional sort of digital signatures that imply that the mailer itself, the company or the sort of the person who sent the message, is genuinely trying to send a good communication versus a spam that goes up to everyone in the list that was purchased and so forth. And it kind of comes down to the audience list, selecting correct people who really opted in to receive these communications, ensuring that you maintain a good practice of list hygiene, so keeping it clean, refreshed, looking and observing behavior of people, the engagement with the messaging, and eventually refining people who sort of drop off communications and or engagement, sort of taking them off, even if they might be opted in still. In addition to that analysis, you would look into bounce rates. So when we start sending communications, there is a practice to say the message was delivered to the end recipient, or there's varieties of reasons why the message might not be delivered, and we get a bit of a feedback around what happened. And this feedback is categorized into multiple types of bounce, and I'll talk about them a bit later on. Message content is another big aspect of, I'm sure that we are all aware of the AI and proliferation of the tools that allow us to, parse the message, to analyze that, and effectively almost build a score, how relevant that could be to you, if we really think about that. The same applies at the sort of sender providers, right? When they receive, like Google would be, when you look at the Google Mail, when all the communications are coming through, most likely they're all scanned, they're all processed, and then besides all the other factors, they'd look and say, what is actually in that content? And to a degree, can we maybe identify the images and what isn't with them today? Again, it's my speculation, but think about that this way. Today, technology is there to do that and support that, and therefore, what is in the message matters. And it requires, I guess, not from administrative standpoint of view, but at least be aware that this is an additional factor to contributing to the sender reputation. Practically, when it comes down to account sort of setup and configuration, what you need to know is that we've got what we refer to as a sender authentication package, or most likely you would see it as referenced as SAP. Don't think it's a brand reference, it's just abbreviation of the sender authentication package. And it consists of these 4, I guess, features, functions, and tools that sort of wrap up together the idea for us of what authentication would look like. Number 1 is account branding. And what I mean by that, I'll give you an example shortly, is defining within the message all the various links or image hosting URLs or some other things, effectively saying we want to brand the account that sends the message with delegated domain name. So everything appears to come from a brand. We want to ensure that our landing pages represent a brand, and therefore you see it in the URL of the landing page. Image hosting. So again, when you look at the images, when you see where they hosted, they have to reference in the same domain that was sort of provided by the customers or yourselves. So that's sort of, we call it like wrapping up all the links, wrapping up all the, unsubscribe and reply to messages and a few others. And then that sort of takes care of what is in the message, what is in the payload, and how do we sort of track and treat some of these URLs across the border. Second part of that is the private domain. So that's where We talk about the from name and from address, and I do remember, I think Natasha was mentioning that as well. You need to validate that when you're configuring your from address in the setup. But for the authenticated domain that comes up through the SAP, you don't have to actually do that. It's already supported through the platform. So therefore, that concept of private domain becomes important, because we now have sort of legitimate from email address that we can use, or a set of email addresses that use our subdomain, and it will be compliant with sender policy frameworks and other domain keys and authentication methods. So that's really kind of authenticating the sending information payload. Third part of that is the dedicated IP address, and it kind of goes back to the concept, as I said. All customers start from fresh, from same point. There is no prehistory of send, and therefore, when we begin our sending experience and sending journey on the platform, we start with a whole new IP address and as I said, most likely a new domain or subdomain that's combined together to sort of serve as a vehicle to send messages. We don't have any means and ways to provide pre-authenticated or pre-configured or pre-warmed up IP addresses. So there is no history of send if you think from that standpoint of view, and there is no reputation that comes with that when we provision that. We don't migrate them from other systems. That's another thing to be aware of. It's just like literally that something is coming up within our platform. And importantly, it provides us that ability to segregate all our communication and reputation to specifically a single customer. Last part of the SAP is reply mail management. And for us, it serves us as a controlling mechanism to provide a bit of the workflow around handling the direct responses to the message. So if someone is having their out of office set up or want to reply to the message and say, I want to unsubscribe from this communication, very common practice still and tactic still. I've seen that number of times even on some of the Slack channels where people trying to kind of stop the messaging, and we would receive I would receive the message. So anyway, when you're responding directly, we have a means to handle these requests, and the RMM itself, or reply mail management, is providing you these configurational tools. So as an administrator, this is one of the things that you do, in fact, have to go and have a look when the account is provisioned and set up to ensure that it contains correct information. Quite often, and that's I've seen and practiced in the past. I'm not sure if that still happens or how often it happens today, but the person who signs up the contract would most of the time in the past be included as the recipient for, reply mail management as like a target. What happens if we can't automatically process that? So, and then someone usually senior in the organization would sort of come to marketers and complain about why all of a sudden I'm getting a bulk of these messages coming through and asking me to unsubscribe and whatnot. So as an admin, it's a really, really good place to go and verify pretty much as soon as you get access to the platform alongside of the business unit sort of physical address and other details, that reply mail management is configured correctly, or at least do a due diligence check. So let's see. Here's an example of the message that comes up with SAP configured. And as you can see, for the communications, we decided that we're going to go with a subdomain delegated to Marketing Cloud will be em.ntodemo.com. And you start seeing that if you kind of go through all of these different headers, you see that there are different sort of flavors of how we use that domain. So we've got in the reply to header within the message, we're using that for RMM. Then we've got some of the other signatures to handle for bounce message controls. You've got a link to the view that as a web page. So the view online link at the top right of the email, it provides ability to preview that email in the browser versus in the email client, and so forth. So there's varieties of these different places where we use these with these sort of authenticated places, but they are sitting within the email message itself. So one way to quickly analyze if things are right or not is send a test email to yourself and then have a look at the details, at the header information, and effectively verify that all the configurations have been applied. This is a significant step to ensure success from early days because, and quite often it comes down to, like if you've got multiple business units to care of, this may or may not have been missed, and validating the step that all of these items have been in fact provisioned is very important. So as an administrator, make sure that you keep track of what configurations have been applied, where, and then more importantly, validate that it is functional and it is in place. And while it is sort of more or less sits with the marketing operations team, maybe as an admin, it's a good responsibility to have. Practically, I've taken an example of e.mynto.com because I just want to be a little bit different and shorter. What you need to know, and not just for exam, but for practical use case as well, is when the domain is being delegated to Marketing Cloud, we kind of have almost some of the host names reserved for functionality within the platform. So if you kind of think about that message header that we just looked at, right, there are a few sort of standard keywords that we are pinning at the front or prefixing the domain itself and using it across different tools. I found that I had a few questions on the exam that were actually sort of testing the knowledge of these different sort of host names and names that we use for adding to subdomains, and therefore just want to make sure that at least A, you've seen them, and B, you kind of study them when you go into the exam, so you understand what the view is, what the click is, what the pages are. But from the other side, for example, if you need to configure these and that, what could be some of the reserved keywords that could not be used for within the domain itself. Quite often, it's not the problem from customer side or administrator side. If you as a client delegate subdomain to Marketing Cloud and we sort of handle it for you, more a challenge could be if the customers are doing self-hosted domain. So we sort of still provide support and configuration within the account and guiding through configuration of the DNS records and how these entries, for example, appear in the domain registrar. But I think overall there's about 16 of these different record types that need to be added, like some of the A type, some of the text type, and so forth. So even though we've got few host names here, there's a bit more because some of the hosts should be referenced like a few times with a different record type. So that's sort of something to keep in mind. Comparing the SAP and private domain, because that is another sort of common A, question line, and B, practical understanding from the administrative point of view. When it comes down to configuration, you always need to ensure that there's a big difference between thinking about SAP itself and the private domain. And because the private domain and SAP can be both sold separately and together, and there could be a case when there is more than a single private domain, but there could be more than a single SAP purchased for the account. So how does it all play together? Let's try to have a look here. Number one is SAP supports account branding. So all these previous hosts that you've just seen, like the bounce, the click, the view, and so forth, these are all packaged up with the SAP configuration. We configure that, and as you can see, there's only one per business unit. So when you do this configuration, when you do this setup, we would configure it at the business unit level and apply that configuration. It could sit at the top level business unit and then be inherited into the first set of children or sub business units, or you can apply it specifically on the selected business units. The point being is still the same. There's only one SAP configured. And if you think very good sort of example we usually refer to is, let's say you have a brand and they may be having like a loyalty communication stream, and they might be doing like a retail communication stream, and they might be doing some, I don't know, like a vehicle rental stream. So three different sort of businesses, but they all belong to the same sort of group company. If you've got retail, it's usually you've got different geolocations. So people are sort of belonging to the same retail brand, but they are distributed geographically and operate as a different businesses, and therefore have slightly different regional domains and a few other requirements and settings. So in these cases, you would go, well, how do I play with that SAP thing, right? One way of doing it is you've got the configuration of SAP applied at the enterprise account level, and then you configure it in such a way, so through the communication with the support and operations team, to ensure that these SAPs apply to all the children business units effectively. So every other business unit will inherit that. That sort of unifies all the brands that use that sender authentication for like all these details within the links, within the image hosting and so forth, they all come unique. They all are the same, using the same domain name. Now, for sending purposes, in these cases, and beyond that, is you've got this private domain. It is included with SAP, right? But in addition to that, you can actually purchase more. So if you do have a brand that has multiple geographical sort of branches, or you've got different types of businesses sitting under the same umbrella, it could be, I don't know, financial fund, health funds, and whatnot. So combining all of them together, that's where you can use private domain, because it authenticates the sending of the message. So it configures, say, we want to send from a particular email address, and that email address has to be set up in such a way that it's being sort of supposed to be trusted by the email sender providers. So that's where it comes into mixture. With private domain, you can have more than a single private domain in a business unit, but you can also apply same private domain across multiple business units within your account. So it's configurable in the same way. You can see that both can be used in the from address, and the interesting point, I've got the asterisk for from address. For private domain, you can see it both can be used for landing pages. For private domain, it is important to remember, you can only configure it to be used as a from address, or you can look at that and use it for using with landing and cloud pages. It's not allowed to intermix that. So you're not allowed to have one domain that you can use in the send, as well as for hosting or referring to your landing pages and web experiences. So that's sort of something to keep in mind. That's the reason for the asterisk. Now, the last point that I have there is a bit more practical angle, is to say, can you use it with the client's corporate domain? But there might be some sort of questions around that, not specifically that use, but anyway. So when it comes down to, say, companies, quite often they go and say, well, you know, we're sending from, well, we're delegating you the subdomain, but we actually want to use our company email addresses when we start sending communications. Is that something that you can support? And the answer is yes, we do have means and configuration to support that, but you'll have to ensure that you do certain ways and certain configurations, and most likely in these cases, you'll be doing the self-hosting of the DNS. We just kind of guide through that. But for SAP, we don't recommend that, because the domain in this case usually comes being the top level domain, and it's used more than just for sending emails within the company, and therefore it's quite challenging because it competes with a lot of other settings that we do. So self-hosting here becomes a big problem. So usually with SAP, we say, no, that doesn't work. But for the private domain, that's absolutely fine. We will support customers on how to configure that. And then they can even get to the point where they can disable RMM, simply because if they're sending from their company email address, they can receive messages and respond to them directly. Like if I'm receiving a recipient subscriber receiving that, responding directly, it goes back to the corporate email address without any limit. So that's something to keep in mind, how they sort of compare and contrast each other. And then some of the additional details are around the dedicated IP address. I think I mentioned, right, we all start from scratch. We all sort of coming up new, and the idea is to provide a dedicated reputational sort of barrier for you when you start sending messages. They can be shared in a similar way across business units, and a single business unit can have more than a single IP address. What is important to keep in mind, and that's something, as you would normally, a bit of a hint, right? If you're preparing for exam, if you see figures, make sure you understand where they are and whether or not they are important to remember for exam. So for each IP address, it must have a sending volume of 250,000 messages a month to maintain a good sending reputation. And then each IP address should not send more than 2 million messages a day. That's sort of above that number. That's where we'll start seeing a bit of deliverability issues, and it potentially will lead to some holdups, and effectively ISPs will start throttling and delaying the deployment. That's something I've seen in practice as well. So making sure that you understand how it works, because one of the things to say, if your company has multiple business units specifically, it might be that you just need to reuse the same IP address across these different brands. If you sort of consider and talk to your team about what the expectations are for messaging, what the overall pool per day, you might actually need to go into maybe 2 or 3 IP addresses sometimes. And even though it might not necessarily be required at the very start, but it's something that you foresee is going to sort of come with the time, maybe 3 months in or 4 months in, then it might be wise to start from day one, essentially working with more than a single IP address. The last point is steady volume is best over time. That's something I'm going to talk next about building reputation, but important to remember that our recommendation based on the practices is to ensure that the send IP is not dormant for more than 30 days. It has to be active, and you just maintain that send volume of the period of time, but it's periodic. It never goes spike up and then drops down. It's not the best practice and usually leads to some of the requirements of rewarming IP addresses. So adjusting the strategy to ensure that you spread across the sends is really a good idea. So when you think about your send reputation, right, the left chart sort of shows you like the send volume. Effectively, someone comes up from the start and says, we need to send a lot of messages on day one. Send reputation usually is damaged at the time and never really recovers. It leads to that tedious conversations, attempts to try and rectify and effectively end up with a new IP address, new subdomain, reconfiguration, and most importantly, a lot of wasted time and effort. So thinking about the whole send build up, how do you do that and how you support businesses from day one is significant and very, very important. So we refer to that as the IP warming approach, and we sort of say that it takes on average 4 to 5 weeks to build up a good reputation, and ensuring that you're not using sort of very little volumes, you're not using that data, you're not using audiences that have been purchased or sort of acquired through sort of shady ways, and really kind of focusing on engaged customers, people who are active in your audience and you know that they've been communicated with, or if you're migrating, or they've been actually subscribed for receiving communications. There's a lot of ways to think about that, but again, it goes steady pace, low volumes at the start, and then effectively grown up over the period of time. We usually would say you kind of start with a certain figure, and then first week you go through that volume, then you double up week on week on week. And a very good example of how we do that is here. You can see that most of the domain breakdowns, they're covering about 20,000 people. And then what we're saying is, again, there's a lot of sort of embedded into the table, but you're thinking about it's a daily volume per domain. So here's an example. You've got AOL and Yahoo, the line 1, right? They're talking about day 1 to 3, 20,000. And day 4 to 5 is 20,000. Day 6 to 7 is 20,000. So what it means is on day 1, let's say Monday, I start sending communications. I have 20,000 people with Yahoo domain. So it could be yahoo.com, it could be yahoo.france, doesn't matter. We're all sort of regional varieties parked together. And then the total volume per day should not exceed 20,000. I mean, it's not 100% hard boundary. If you've got 20,150, that's fine. It's more the overall idea of how do you bucket that up. And if you have a send that needs to go to more than 20,000, you kind of have to split it across more than a single day. So it's a daily volume per domain. That's what's important to remember. And then once you start going through the week 2, which is day 8 to 14, and then further on, you see that the figures are effectively doubling up. The Gmail is the one that starts a bit slower. So we go and say, well, day 1 to 3, you use sort of roughly 5,000 emails. And then day 4 to 5, you get to 10. And then day 6 to 7, you get to 20,000. It doesn't mean that you have to send every single day of the week. And it doesn't mean that these are the exact numbers that you're going to go. And if you skip day 4 and 5 and go 6, 7, you switch straight to 20,000. It's just more indicative sort of volume build up, right? Remember, so it's all indication. It's all about being paced and being sort of settled and have a strategy about how do you target your audience. The IP warming requires domain breakdown. So you need to be skilled in segmenting, whether it's a bit of a SQL magic, whether it's using some tools, maybe deselect was one of the great things that might help with that. I think just kind of visualizing how you do that and how you operate with it. Ultimately, the point being is you need to kind of split your audience and segment it across different domains. We have a great reports that support this sort of actions. And once you start using that, you'll get more familiar with that. But I guess as an administrator, this is more, you need to keep an eye on what are the sending volumes daily and sort of monitoring some of the results on tracking details to say, Is there a big spike of bounces? Is there a big spike of unsubscribes? Are we sort of feeling that we might be caught up by one of the ISPs who's going to really hit us hard because we're losing credibility and so forth? For other use cases, if you've got, for example, a very small audience, or if it's hard to sort of build up that volume over the domains, it could be the B2B use cases. That's what we recommend. We'll say, just look at the IP warming down through the daily volume breakdown. So you go, first week is 50,000. That's essentially, you don't need to be skilled to write SQL and figure out domain breakdown. You just literally say, I need 50,000 people randomly selected. If you've got a bit more, split them across the days and send it out. So you kind of see the incremental build up. The reason for that particular guidance is we've seen that it will sort of fall within the per domain guidelines anyway, because you're sort of doing a bit of that randomness and essentially not going to hit, unless your audience is 100% Google or Yahoo, it shouldn't lead to you sort of overflooding with the communications altogether. One quick thing to say, practically, what do you do? Where do you look for if you want to validate the SAP was applied on the account? The very first step, remember I said that you send yourself a test email, but the very first step as an admin, you just go up into your settings, you look at the account settings, and you see that portfolio-based URL. And that's the link I've got highlighted on the image. Hopefully it comes through. So for me, it still comes with image.s4.sfmc-content.com, which tells me this is not SAP authentication. This is just standard Marketing Cloud hosting domain. And this is what really kind of shows, like, most likely the configuration hasn't been completed yet. So keep an eye on that. Reasoning being, again, before we start sending, it is important to ensure that the SAP private domain, all of these authentication tools have been configured correctly and are ready to go, right? So you as an administrator would be responsible for that and be on the standby for it. Okay, the other side, a bit more practical. You may or may not be tested in that on the exam, but I find that this is fascinating that not a lot of our customers know about, and not all of our partners are usually using that always. So reputation audit is something that is fantastic as a tool to actually understand if these technical configurations have been completed as well. So run these periodically as an admin. It's a support ticket, request reputation audit test. You get this sort of breakdown that tells you all of these different status, like checks against blacklist, authentication, DNS settings, reviews content, all this sort of stuff. It doesn't measure inbox delivery, okay, versus spam folder delivery. It's not that. This is very helpful to confirm that all the technical settings are in place and they are correct. So this is more assessing your account, and with a bit of historical velocity that, for example, blacklist and stuff, these are the things that would pop up here if you would see them. So that's another great thing to have in your toolbox as an admin, to say, once in 3 months, I probably should do that and have a look and see if we're still all green and healthy. The second bit, which is similar to that, is bounce detective. So requesting it to be configured, it sort of needs to be proactive from your side, and then it becomes proactive from our side. We would provide a bit of a status report for, it's more, we're not doing it as a report, it's more, you will be notified once there is a flag, or once there's an alert from our bounce detective to say there's some really unexpected high volume of bounces on that particular domain. You need to look at that. And that is really, really important, because it might sort of indicate that there is a bit of an ISP blocking happening for your sends. It could be, especially at the start, I've seen in the past that, Yahoo was one of them. There've been a couple of others, domains that people were reporting and say, I think it was Microsoft actually, saying, look, we just started with day 3 and like we are completely red on bounces. We seem to be blocked, and what do we do? So this report can help, or this proactive alert can help to keep track of that, not just at the start, but really further down the line. You can specify who should receive these email alerts, and then you'll get a bit of a report with a breakdown of all of these things. The important thing is it's not monitoring triggered sends or any automation. It's only batch sending, but it's still a very useful thing. And if you configure it at the enterprise level, then all child accounts and business units are effectively monitored through that. So it's a great tool. I would definitely encourage you to be aware of that. And then practically for exam, being aware of the bounce types and what is the overall process. I don't want to go into the actual process itself in detail. There is a really good write-up. I find it useful if you spend a bit of time to kind of fully understand what and how it works. and what it is. But for example, please do know what are these different types of bounces that we have supported, because they are, I had 1 or 2 questions around that in terms of what is sort of managed and supported, and what are the different types. So ensure you understand the differences between, I don't know, the soft bounce and the hard bounce, and how do they influence and change the status of the subscriber if the bounce is received, because we've got sort of different mechanisms and workflows that operate. And as an administrator, it is important for you to be aware of that. If you are assisting with a list health checks to your marketing team, and making sure that you together work cohesively on prolonged strategy around handling that. So you might be the person who sort of discovers the potential challenge, and then your marketing team would be the ones responding to that and acting from the strategical standpoint of view and so forth. So these are quite important things to be aware of. Okay, that takes me to second part of the topic, the security best practices. I find that that was a bit easier on the exam, but the reference for before we start is really understand that there is data on the account that has a marketing sort of need, but it could have a bit of a sensitive flavor to it. And usually in the context of data security, there's the reference to the PII, or personal identifiable information. And there are a few definitions that I've seen. Again, we've got a trail that talks about the privacy, and it's funny because, well, not funny, it's interesting, more rather than funny, fascinating, I should say. When you read it for GDPR, the US legislative, like the California Act, they all have different definitions, legal definitions, and it goes back to some of my point I've made earlier, is it varies across the globe, and today it's more and more so. Therefore, some of these concepts could be slightly differently worded, like a private data, for example, might feel like it's the same as personally identifiable information in the GDPR context, but actually it's a bit more than that. It's a bit more strict, and it implies that anything that identifies an individual essentially, is treated as a private data or PII. But for private data under GDPR legislation, they even consider cookies to be that, I think it was like in the definition was transmitting frequency, radio frequency that can identify you uniquely, is still is part of the private data, and therefore has to be treated with a certain, with a certain workflow and process in mind. And then in addition to the PII itself that identifies individuals, so things like your first name, last name, social security numbers and whatnot, there are any other information that is linked or linkable. So medical, educational, financial, employment, all of these things, they sort of break down into 2 parts. And to make it easy for you, linked is usually something that is on its own, is a definitive and distinct. So social security number, driver license number, well, it's not necessarily your, your own detail, but they identify you. So it's linked to your identity. It's something that says, yeah, this is Vlad, we know, and we can verify him. Versus linkable information, that's something that doesn't really do much on its own. So if you look at the zip or postal codes for us, if I say, well, I'm in that particular postal code, if you're related with my details, my name, my last name, my phone number, then all of a sudden it becomes important. If you just take the postcode out of the context, then it doesn't have that sort of meaningful value in the sense of identifying individuals. So it's when it's combined together with some of the identifiers, then it becomes additional payload that's still treated as the PII essentially. So for us, when it comes down to the context of why does it matter and what you can do, there are a few options to handle the data within the platform. I try to break it down into a simple, hopefully, way to remember and memorize that. So you've got 3 things that you need to know and be aware of. I've got, I think, 2 questions around these different types of tools in the exam in my take. So essentially, number 1 is you've got something that is at the database level, so transparent data encryption. It's the reference to encryption. It says it's encryption at rest, meaning when the data is on the drive, on the disk drive, it's in an encrypted state. Practically, it applies for more like a physical security component, where if someone actually steals the hard drive, they won't be able to do anything with that because the data is encrypted. So if you take the hard drive, you try to sort of look into that. If you've seen movies like CSIs and whatnot, they kind of get into that conflict to say, well, we can't really access the data because it was encrypted. That's effectively that. There's absolutely zero impact on the application usability in the UI. So when you log into Marketing Cloud, when you work with data, it's the same as without that. You don't see that as the named user. So this is something more physical security. It could be legally required for companies to ensure that this is in place. And that's why that particular selection and investment could be made at the account level. It is important to know that this is something that has to be, actually most of them, all of them have to be provisioned at the start of the account usage. If you kind of finding yourself being an admin and you know that your company talks about data security and you know that nothing have been done at the purchase level, like maybe it was sort of missed and whatnot, maybe it's a new feature that's coming up now, you might end up migrating your account because all of these have to be activated at the very early days. And any historical data that sits on the account cannot be really transformed to be moved into this encrypted state, if you will. A second tool is a field level encryption, similar to the TDE. It's encryption at rest, but it's at the field level. So instead of we're talking about encrypting the whole database, every single thing, every single table, every single record, every single field, we're actually talking about specific fields. And that's where configuration-wise, we have to be involved to configure it and set it up. But once it's set up, there's a bit more control from the user standpoint of view to define which fields will be encrypted and secured, therefore. It does require the key value and initialization vector to set up within the application. So as an administrator, that becomes part of your responsibility to maintain these keys. We sort of are looking after you bring your own keys. We don't want to enforce our keys. We want to ensure that even us internally don't have access to the data. So you load it up into your account, you use these keys, you look after them, you can rotate them if the need comes in and so forth. It sort of becomes your responsibility to handle. Again, it applies at the account level for all new accounts, and it does in fact imply certain limits on how you use the data, because if it is encrypted, I'm going to go into the data extension and have a look. Encrypted records will appear encrypted. The data is not deciphered until the send time. So we only decrypt it at send. I think there are one or two additional contexts where we might be using that. So if you go into the landing pages personalization, it still would sort of do certain behavior. But think of that before send, the data sits in the sort of encrypted gibberish payload. And when you look at that, there's nothing you can do with it. It's helpful. It's very useful for protecting sensitive data. But at the same time, even in my experience, was the conversation needs to happen in terms of what marketers expect to be able to use for segmentation purposes versus what we need to encrypt. Because if the data is encrypted, you are operating from the segmentation standpoint of view with a completely encrypted payload. So you can't distinguish if it's the same postcode or not. And the argument we always had was, if it's a postcode against the user, yes, it is linked information. And yes, it does provide a part of that PI payload. But if the marketers need or have a requirement to segment people using the postcode, we have to have it in plain text. There is no other way around that. Well, except maybe the last option. So again, considering that as being field level, so you've got the data in, you can choose which fields you want to sort of tinker with and make secure and encrypted and open up at the same time. The tokenized sending is another sort of amalgamation of that. So this is completely off the platform data store. Thinking about the data residency issues where the sensitive data cannot maybe leave the boundaries of the company. And therefore, what we can provide them is ability to store a single token that identifies individual. From the platform standpoint of view, the way it works is we send the message, and at the same time, at the sent time, Marketing Cloud will make a series of API calls to retrieve the payload from the token. So we use the token, talk to an implemented service that will decipher it and provide attributes that are related to the token within the same context. We don't store that. It's only used within the same time. So you can still personalize the message. You can still have variables. You can still have dynamic content sort of built up and so forth. But it's all going to be at the same time on. Once the send is done, the data is disposed of. We don't log it. We don't store it. It's literally send time. So in this case, it's even not worse, but like in the same way, it doesn't really help comparing to field level encryption, because you still cannot segment people using these attributes that really reside within the tokenized service. They don't sit on the Marketing Cloud platform. This requirement is very useful when you've got like the cases that we've seen as financial or health industry sectors where people are sort of concerned, as I said, some data can never leave the boundaries of other company sort of IT infrastructure. And therefore, what they provide is the exposed service to us, where we can talk to them at the platform level and say, for that particular token, can we please request additional details about the individual? It doesn't restrict marketing data in a way. So you can still bring up all other attributes. You can still bring up additional data points and link them and merge them together and sort of do some operations with SQL and relationships and whatnot. But the actual content that is hidden behind the token is off the platform. For example, please do know all of these different types. Ensure that you understand the differences, which one can be used when and should be used when. And in the context, as I said, I think I've got a couple of questions around these, more from the perspective of which security option would be the most appropriate for a given scenario. A few other things, and these are more operational security features that I wanted to ensure that they covered. I sort of looked into most of the presentations. I don't believe we talked about them, so therefore I just want to touch base on them. The allow lists, and I do know that in the, hopefully it's been rectified everywhere. If there is anywhere a reference to whitelist, it's effectively allow list. So we talk about at least 3 categories that you see in the security section. Number one is login IP allow list, and this is the one that governs IP restriction for accessing Marketing Cloud account. There are 3 different settings that how that IP login IP list applies. Therefore, we can sort of just log the information about people who are accessing the platform outside of restricted IP range or IP addresses. We can log and let them in, and we can block completely and entirely. So there's a combination of settings in the security where you need to enable how you handle it, but the login IP allow list is effectively the place where you configure all of these approved or allowed IP addresses for accessing the account. Second is the export email allow list, and that's an interesting one because it does sort of talk about the data security too. In few places on the platform, you can send information to yourself or to someone else to their email address. And in these cases where specifically you're extracting subscriber data, right? Something that could be that PII or linked information about the individuals, you might want to actually restrict and say, well, not everyone should be allowed to receive the emails with the details. So therefore, that's where you would go up and configure these email addresses or domains to say, these are the ones that are approved to receive exports or extracts from Marketing Cloud via email. It's specifically via email. It's not about exporting data onto FTP. It's email. So you send yourself an email down. And then the last list here is the main allow list. It's a bit more of a legacy tool for like redirecting to. So let's say you've got a web form that might be an extension of the custom preference center, and it's hosted on the customer website. It's sort of inbuilt into their website, so it's sort of iframe. And when the form is submitted, then we want to redirect to another place. And domains are different, not necessarily approved. This system will go and say, well, it seems like there's a bit of an issue here with trust, because you start with one domain and you're trying that you can redirect from this page to this page within Marketing Cloud, and restricting it so no one else can effectively emulate and simulate that and provide sort of malicious forms and payloads that will spam your data collection tools. So that's something kind of like to keep in mind. There's 3 things that are quite important that you need to know. But what's more interesting is you need to ensure that you don't mix them with IP addresses for allow lists. So when you go into the help section that I linked here, there's a whole lot of different IP addresses that we refer to as allow lists, but they are from within your company. Why would you even need them, or when would you consider them? These are the items when you have different tools maybe interacting with Marketing Cloud. So if you have an API integration with Marketing Cloud between your internal infrastructure and us, if you sending email addresses sending emails and they're not reaching out your corporate domain, it's more importantly, so that Marketing Cloud allow list for messaging and integrations is the one that needs to be paid a specific attention to. So if your spam filter is some sort of smarter than others, they might figure it out. But in a number of cases where you can go and find yourself, we're sending an email and then the user is not receiving that email. So proof email, right? And quite often they go, oh, Marketing Cloud doesn't work. You know, we need to do this and we need to do that. Practically, it's not. It's not on our side. It's on the company side. And as an admin, you could be the person to actually educate them to say, hey guys, we've got, you know, a firewall, we've got mail filters installed and configured. We need to ensure that we whitelist domain names or IP addresses for Marketing Cloud to allow all of these messages and activities to successfully come through to our platform and system and infrastructure and inboxes. Okay, so that's where you kind of need to ensure that you understand that different whitelist. The first set that I was talking to is more from the platform capability perspective. These are the ones that essentially saying we need to ensure that we allowing our tools to talk to Marketing Cloud and vice versa. And emails have to come through because they're using our corporate domain and all of a sudden not reaching the inbox. So you just need to ensure that you're allowing Marketing Cloud to sort of come through and whitelist them within the spam filters or any other controls that might be there. And I believe the very last point for me to kind of briefly touch on was the operational security. And again, it's the audit trail. It sort of sees something that is not necessarily relevant to data security, but it is still significant because it provides you as administrator to keep track of what users are doing within the platform and monitor some of their behaviors. And you need to ensure that you understand that there are two different types. So there's a basic audit trail versus advanced. They both accessed through Automation Studio and API. So you can do it one way or another. You're extracting that sort of payload of the logs. The basic functionality is included with all accounts. So you don't have to pay any price. You just need to enable it, start collecting the data, and then you can access it as you go along. It has a 30-day retention timeline, and it gives you not basic setup, but it's really focused around setup and user events. So if someone is, you know, login IP address, login event, they might be changing their passwords, they log out. So these are the type of events you would see and some of the configurations within the setup. If you think about advanced trail, it has significantly more payload and it has 60-day retention, as you can see, period. But it's an extra price, and therefore that's something that requires account executive to be involved in order to enable and activate and make it happen. But as you get that, then it becomes a bit more interesting because you get the data around everything that's with basic plus extended setup configuration, some of the changes that you do in email, mobile studios, whether it's SMS or push, doesn't matter, cloud pages, and even Google Analytics connector. These are critical for, I guess, marketing operational standpoint of view, and you do want to keep an eye on some of the changes that people may accidentally make. So if that is something that is in your account, do make a good use of that. But at least from an exam perspective, just know that the differences between them. I would encourage you to have a look into what type of events that are sort of captured in a bit more detail, because it's two pretty big tables, like visually big, and it's not a huge level of data to comprise, but they're super useful for administrators when you start monitoring your account and kind of working through that. All right. How about a bit of a quick review? I've got a few questions. I'm not judging them. So part of my, I guess, not legacy, but the context and agreement is I can't really give you a very well-defined example questions for the exam, even if they're not necessarily 100% accurate. So I cannot try to make it a bit more as just an experience to remind you what comes and what doesn't. So if you think about the Camp Spam Act, what information needs to be included in the commercial email sent to comply with the spam? And I'm guessing, if we don't mind, you just type into the chat what letter do you think is the right answer. And let's see, you've got C. That's good. Majority of answers, actually all of the answers seem to be counting C. At least it means that you've been paying attention, which is great. It is in fact C. It's a company physical address that we want to ensure that is included in the commercial email sent. That's good. Now, which two features are included with the sender authentication package? Let's see if you can figure that one out quickly. So we've got private address, private IP address, reply mail management, account branding, common domain. B and C, B and C. Okay. I'm glad that you picked up my tricks. Oh gosh, we've got a very smart audience here. I guess there's no way to trick you all around that. So yes, it's a reply mail management and account branding, because for private IP address, we actually have a dedicated IP address. That would be the better use of the term. I think I'm gonna skip one of the questions, but let's say I'll rephrase it. So what is the minimum daily volume of sends that is required for dedicated IP addresses? I should have not daily, it's supposed to be monthly. So what would be the answer if you think about this? What is the minimum monthly volume of sends that is required for 2 dedicated IP addresses? Okay, there's a bit of a mix here. Nice, that's right. So it is C, because it's 2 IP addresses. So remember that the lower threshold is significant when you think about the IP sort of warming and your reputation sort of status. Is you need to ensure that your account is constantly maintaining that same volume, and at the very minimum is 250,000 per month per IP address. So if your company has more than a single IP address, that's a pretty good consideration to have, and significant number for someone with a smaller volumes of send. So definitely do pay attention. All right. I think that would be the last one. What bounce type signals problems with sending domain authentication? I didn't drill into that myself specifically, but I had it on the slide. So if you paid attention, I'm wondering if people will recognize that. So have a look and see if you just guess it out. So you've got D, A, C, another D. And it's a bit of a tricky question too, so I take full responsibility for that. Hey, there you go. Good mix. Well, if you've been one of the people who said it's D, then you got it right. It is a block bounce. Hard bounce, easy bounce, soft bounce, yeah, just not necessarily what we were looking for. Good one. I do have one more. So that was one of the last topics to cover. So what data security, what security feature will support use of sensitive data in segmentation? So see if you remember that, which one of the options will provide the ability to still work with the sensitive data when it comes down to segmentation. I love that this is more of a, this is kind of like more of a real question that you might face in the exam, like in terms of context and how that would be framed. I think that would be something to keep in mind. There's not much you can ask about that, I guess, altogether. So if you answered B, it's correct. The tokenized sending, remember, it's data that is off the platform. So again, just kind of reiterating that, it's something to remember, that anything to do with tokenization, think about, I've got like a token, think about like a coin that you have, and that coin allows you to request a service to get all the information about the individual. The field level encryption, it's in the name, right? It's at the field level, so it's not a whole lot. And if it's field, it means that the data in the user interface is going to be completely hidden. So you can't do anything with that. It's encrypted payload. Marketing Cloud Shield, I did purposely drop it in because I want to encourage you to do a bit of exploration. What do we consider to be Marketing Cloud Shield? It's a combination of the audit log and the other things. So kind of it's a legit term, but yeah, practically the answer is B here. Okay, that sort of rounds me up. I do just wanted to jump before that. So I'll just say there are a couple of things that I feel would be important if you haven't done them, to kind of go through the trails when you go through the links. And then when the deck is shared, you've seen like a number of slides. I do have extra links on each of the slide, kind of to make sure that they're contextually placed. And if you feel like you need to drill into these sections, feel free to use them as well. And I'm going to take if there are any questions I can help with. I'm happy to help out and answer them.
Thanks much, Vlad. That's a lot of content, and these are all important topics, not just for the certification, but for an administrator, it's very important to be aware of all these topics. Thank you very much, Vlad. And I love your tip about how to remember the tokenized sending, the transparent data encryption and all.
And yeah, something that worked for me. Yeah.
Coming to the questions, thanks to Chris, Bonnie, Courtney, Tracy, and few others who have been answering the questions in the chat window. And we do have a question. And if anybody has any questions, please type them in the chat window. So we have a few minutes left, so we can address them. One question. So enable audit trail data collection is grayed out. If that's the case, do we need to reach out to the support or?
I'm just going to speculate here a little bit. From memory, I feel like there was an additional permission required for enabling the trail. Just validate the user permissions, because I think it needs to be explicitly, I think one of the sessions was talking about, explicitly granted permissions versus just not denied, not granted. So you need to allow for audit trail sort of configuration if you're administrator explicitly in your roles and permissions. So check that. If it doesn't help, then yeah, certainly drop a note to support. I'm sure they'll be able to sort it out for you, because most likely it's a permission, but if it's not, then I'll have to enable it for you.
Yeah, and for the advanced audit trail, I don't know if I remember correctly or not. For the advanced audit trail, we need to get in touch with the support, I believe.
Yeah, it's not just support. I think it's with account executive, because from memory, and hopefully I'm sort of not missing out anything right now, because I haven't been with the sort of selling motions for quite a long time now. But I believe that's still a paid feature, and therefore, if you do need advanced audit trail, you actually have to engage your account executive first to talk to them, and if they will be giving you that for free, that's great. But if not, it's something that to discuss anyway, because it might be paid feature depending on your account and contractual sort of status.
That's great, Vlad. I think those are all the questions. Most of the questions have been answered in the chat itself. So
that's good. Thank you very much for all the people who supported that. Because yeah, I've seen Chris was I've seen this was picking up like a lot of conversations. So I appreciate your help. It's always good that someone else monitors that.
And if anybody has any questions left out, you did not get an opportunity to ask them, or we have the opportunity for the Ask Me Anything panel that is on 18th. So make sure I will be sharing a form for you to fill in the questions ahead of the session. So look for it in the Slack channel and fill that out. So you get an opportunity that the question will be asked during the session. And the next session is going to be on Journey Builder concepts and the MC Connect. That is on Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern. And the next sessions are going to be on at 3 p.m. Eastern. And thanks everyone for joining. And any other communications, any other questions, we will be posting and answering them in the Slack channel. And thanks once again, Vlad.
Thank you all. Have a great day. Take care. Goodbye.
Yes, take care. Bye.